Movies didn't just exaggerate the Wild West, they straight up invented it. Perfect duels, fearless lone cowboys, clean saloons, clear heroes. None of that existed. The real Wild West was short, dirty, chaotic, badly organized, and often embarrassingly stupid. In this video, we're ripping apart 44 dumbest Wild West myths Hollywood drilled into your head, and replacing them with reality that's way less cool and way more ridiculous. 1. The dramatic high noon duel is the biggest lie ever sold to us because real gunfights were actually just clumsy disasters with terrible visibility. If two cowboys actually stood in the middle of the street and fired at the stroke of 12, they would probably both miss and hit a window 3 blocks away. The black powder used in those old revolvers created a massive cloud of thick white smoke instantly after the first shot, so you were basically shooting blindly into a fog bank while coughing your lungs out. Most folks were not squinting coolly at their enemies. They were frantically waving smoke away, trying to see where the other guy went. The reality was less about sharpshooting skills and more about who could run away or hide behind a water trough the fastest without tripping over their own spurs. 2. Those giant cowboy hats are actually terrible at being hats, and the real kings of the West looked like confused accountants. Hollywood loves the wide-brimmed Stetson because it looks cool, but in the real world of physics, that thing is just a giant kite waiting for a breeze. The vast open prairie is incredibly windy, so if you wore a movie-style hat, you would spend half your day chasing it across the dirt like a goofy cartoon character. That is why the real tough guys wore bowler hats or derbies, which fit tight on the head and were aerodynamic enough to stay on during a gallop. Famous outlaws like Butch Cassidy were running from the law while wearing the same hat your banker wears because looking cool is less important than actually having a hat on your head. 3. The tumbling tumbleweed is the most famous symbol of the Wild West. Yet it is actually a Russian invader that arrived way too late to the party. These dry, rolling bushes were accidentally brought over in shipments of flaxseed from Russia in the 1870s, which means the early pioneers never actually saw one. Hollywood loves to put them in every scene to show how desolate the land is, but historically speaking, those weeds are just agricultural pests that took over the ecosystem. If you see a movie set in the 1850s featuring a tumbleweed, you are watching a botanical time travel paradox, because that plant was still sitting in a field in Siberia. 4. The ruggedly handsome cowboy on screen is a total fraud because the actual Wild West smelled like a rotting badger wrapped in dirty gym socks. Hygiene was basically non-existent, and cowboys would wear the same wool clothes for months without washing, which created a stench so powerful it could probably knock a buzzard out of the sky. When they finally did bathe, it was usually in a communal tub at a bathhouse where the water was changed so rarely that by the end of the day, you were essentially scrubbing yourself with other people's liquid filth. If you met a real cowboy today, you would not swoon over his masculinity. You would hand him a bar of soap and call a hazmat team. 5. Bank robberies were about as common as a polite rattlesnake because trying to rob one was historically the stupidest idea possible. We think the West was full of constant heists, but historians have only found evidence of about a dozen actual bank robberies across 15 states over 40 years. Banks were usually built right in the middle of town, often sharing a wall with the sheriff or the marshal, so you were walking into a building surrounded by armed citizens who were bored and looking for excitement. Smart outlaws robbed trains in the middle of nowhere because robbing a bank in a town center was basically asking the entire population to come out and use you for target practice. 6. The so-called lawless frontier actually had more rules and regulations than a grumpy homeowners association. We imagine everyone walking around with iron on their hips, but real frontier towns like Dodge City and Tombstone had extremely strict laws against carrying weapons. The first thing a cowboy saw when riding into town was a big sign telling him to check his gun at the sheriff's office or the hotel front desk like it was a coat check. The famous OK Corral incident was not a battle for freedom. It was literally Wyatt Earp acting like a strict hall monitor and trying to take guns away from cowboys who were breaking the local no-weapons policy. 7. The U.S. Army actually tried to replace horses with camels in Texas, and it was one of the weirdest experiments that nobody talks about. The government imported dozens of camels from the Middle East, thinking they would be perfect for the dry desert terrain of the Southwest, but they forgot that camels are huge jerks. The camels scared the horses to death and spat on the soldiers and smelled even worse than the cowboys, which is truly saying something. The experiment was a total disaster because the camels were too stubborn to follow orders and would wander off to eat cactus, so the army eventually just let them loose to roam the Texas desert like hairy, confused tourists. 8. The American cowboy is basically a cover band of the Mexican vaquero because almost everything we associate with the West was borrowed from down south. The word cowboy itself is just a translation of vaquero, and all the cool gear like chaps and lassos and branding irons were invented by Mexican herders long before English speakers showed up. Even the demographics are totally wrong in movies because historians estimate that 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and they were critical to the cattle industry. Hollywood spent a century pretending the West was entirely white, but the reality is that the most iconic American symbol is actually a blend of Mexican culture and diverse workers who were just trying to earn a paycheck. 9. People in the Wild West were so desperate for water that they actually paid con artists to shoot cannons at the sky to wake up the rain clouds. This practice was called Pluaculture, and it was based on the incredibly stupid scientific theory that loud noises and explosions would squeeze moisture out of the atmosphere. Towns would pool their money to hire these self-proclaimed professors who would set up bizarre mortars and dynamite launchers to wage war against the weather. The only thing they succeeded in doing was making a lot of noise and occasionally blowing things up while the sky remained perfectly blue and the crops continued to wither away. 10. Ordering a whiskey in a saloon was basically a game of Russian roulette with your liver because the booze was often literal poison. The stuff they served was rarely aged in oak barrels but was instead a terrifying mixture known as rot gut, which was raw alcohol mixed with ammonia and gunpowder and cayenne pepper to fake the burn of high-proof liquor. Some bartenders even added turpentine or snakeheads to the barrel to give it a kick, which means the patrons were drinking industrial solvents and dead reptiles just to get a buzz. If you drank that stuff today, your stomach would likely dissolve and you would wake up blind, which explains why everyone in the old photos looks so angry. 11. The myth of the strong, silent cowboy is hilarious because real cowboys were actually incredibly chatty and desperate for attention. Being a cowboy meant spending weeks or months alone on the range with nothing but cows for company, so when they finally reached civilization, they would not shut up. They were known for being loud storytellers who would brag endlessly to anyone who would listen because they had been talking to their horses for 40 days straight. The movie trope of the brooding hero who says 2 words a day was invented by screenwriters who didn't want to write dialogue because the real guys were basically lonely chatterboxes. 12. Every movie character seems to own a majestic stallion, but in reality, owning a horse was a financial nightmare that most people could not afford. A horse consumes a massive amount of food and water every single day, which makes it a terrible investment if you are just a poor prospector trying to buy beans. Most people in the West actually walked everywhere or rode in uncomfortably crowded wagons because horses were luxury items reserved for the wealthy or those who actually needed them for work. The idea of every random drifter having a personal horse tied up outside the saloon is as silly as everyone in a modern city driving a Ferrari to the grocery store. 13. The gold rush was essentially a giant pyramid scheme where the only people who actually got rich were the ones selling shovels to gullible idiots. Thousands of people rushed to California expecting to trip over giant nuggets, but the vast majority found absolutely nothing except debt and dysentery. The real geniuses were the merchants who charged astronomical prices for eggs and picks and denim pants because they knew the miners were desperate enough to pay anything. It was the ultimate hustle where the people digging the holes did all the work while the shopkeepers sat back and collected all the actual gold without getting their hands dirty. 14. Those swinging batwing doors on saloons are the worst architectural invention in history, and most bars had actual solid front doors. Movies love the swinging doors because they look dramatic when a cowboy bursts through them, but in reality, they would let in all the dust and the freezing cold wind and the stray dogs. Saloon owners wanted to keep their paying customers comfortable, so they used normal wooden doors to keep the weather outside where it belonged. The flappy doors might have existed inside to separate the kitchen or back rooms, but putting them on the main entrance would just make the entire bar drafty and miserable for everyone drinking there. 15. The Pony Express is the most overhyped failure in the history of communication because the whole thing was a financial disaster that lasted only 18 months. We treat it like this massive legendary institution that defined an era, but it went bankrupt faster than a lemonade stand in a blizzard the moment the telegraph was invented. It was incredibly expensive to send a letter, and the writers were mostly tiny teenagers who were risking their lives just to deliver mail that was weeks old anyway. The entire operation lost a fortune and existed for such a short blink of time that most people in the West never even saw a writer before the whole company collapsed. 16. We act like the Wild West lasted for hundreds of years, but the actual era was shorter than the run of most TV sitcoms. The open range period really only lasted from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to about 1895, when barbed wire and railroads closed everything down. That is barely 30 years of history, yet we have produced thousands of movies about it. The legendary gunfighters and cattle drives were a tiny blip in time that vanished almost instantly, but American pop culture stretched those 3 decades into an eternal epoch because reality was just too short to be entertaining. 17. Breaking a whiskey bottle over someone's head during a bar fight is a classic movie move, but in real life that bottle would not shatter like sugar glass. Glass bottles in the 19th century were made to be incredibly thick and durable, so they could survive being transported on bumpy wagons without leaking precious liquor everywhere. If you actually hit someone with a real vintage bottle, it would be like hitting them with a solid brick, and the bottle would likely stay in one piece while the other guy stayed on the floor permanently. The harmless shattering effect is a complete fabrication by prop departments, because hitting a skull with heavy glass is not a fun way to end an argument, it is just physics doing its job. 18. Hollywood actors always have perfect pearly white teeth, but a real cowboy smile was usually terrifying enough to make a mirror crack. Dental hygiene on the frontier was basically non-existent, and the diet consisted mostly of dried meat and sugary beans and endless amounts of chewing tobacco which turned teeth into brown stumps. There were no professional dentists in most towns, so if you had a toothache, you went to the local barber or blacksmith who would just yank the tooth out with a pair of rusty pliers used for pulling nails. The dashing hero with the minty fresh breath is a total lie because real historical figures likely had breath that could peel the paint off a barn wall. 19. Putting your ear to the ground to track a herd of buffalo or an approaching posse is one of those things that looks cool but makes absolutely no sense. Movies act like the ground is a magical telephone line that transmits high-definition audio from miles away, but in reality you are just getting dirt in your ear canal. Unless a massive stampede is literally right next to you, the ground does not vibrate enough to tell you anything useful about how many riders are coming or what they are eating for lunch. This myth started because people saw native trackers doing it, but misinterpreted the technique, which was usually just checking for very specific tremors and not listening for footprints like a cartoon detective. 20. Quicksand was the ultimate movie villain that swallowed entire wagons and screaming horses. But in reality, it is just wet, sloppy sand that cannot actually kill you. The physics of quicksand are pretty simple because the human body is less dense than the sand and water mixture, which means you will naturally float once you get in up to your waist. The idea that you get sucked down into a bottomless pit is pure fiction invented to add drama to boring travel scenes because the worst thing that would happen in real quicksand is that you would lose your boots and feel really silly. You could literally sit in a pool of quicksand all day and read a newspaper without sinking, because gravity does not work the way screenwriters want it to. 21. Riding in a stagecoach was the 19th century equivalent of being put inside a tumble dryer full of dust and regrets. Movies make it look like a scenic road trip with witty banter, but in reality, those wooden boxes had zero suspension and relied on stiff leather straps that made every pebble feel like a boulder. The motion was so violent that passengers frequently suffered from intense seasickness right there in the middle of the desert, which made the cramped interior smell absolutely delightful. You were squeezed in with strangers for days, breathing in choking clouds of dirt, while bouncing around so hard that wearing a hat was physically impossible without it being jammed over your eyes. 22. The glorious log cabin is the classic home of every movie pioneer, but most settlers on the plains actually lived in houses made of dirt and grass. The Great Plains had almost zero trees, so people had to slice up the ground like brownies and stack chunks of sod to build walls. Living in a sod house meant that when it rained, the roof would leak mud directly into your dinner, and bugs were essentially your roommates. It was not uncommon for a cow to wander onto the roof to graze on the grass and occasionally fall through the ceiling right into the living room, which is a design flaw that modern architecture has thankfully fixed. 23. Shooting a flaming arrow at a person is the stupidest military tactic ever invented because Hollywood ignores basic medical science. If you shoot someone with a fire arrow, the heat actually cauterizes the wound as it enters, which stops the bleeding and essentially performs emergency surgery on the guy you are trying to kill. Indigenous tribes were expert warriors, and they knew that flaming arrows were only useful for burning down dry wagons or buildings, not for shooting at enemies. The idea of an archer taking the time to light a fuse during a chaotic battle just to shoot a projectile that helps his enemy survive is a level of absurdity that only a screenwriter could invent. 24. The traveling medicine show was the ultimate example of gullibility because people happily bought bottles of swamp water to cure everything from baldness to broken legs. These smooth-talking salesmen were not selling herbal remedies, they were selling mixtures of gasoline and pepper and strange oils that usually did absolutely nothing except burn your throat. The crowd would watch a fake entertainment act and then throw money at a guy in a top hat who promised that his magical elixir would make them live forever. It is hilarious to think that folks who were tough enough to survive on the frontier were easily tricked by a guy with a mustache and a bottle of spicy turpentine. 25. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad is remembered as a dignified historic moment, but the actual ceremony was a hilarious comedy of errors. The famous golden spike that connected the tracks was supposed to be driven in by two wealthy railroad tycoons, but both of them were so incompetent with manual labor that they completely missed the spike. They swung the heavy silver hammers and hit the rail or the dirt instead, which was incredibly embarrassing in front of the gathered crowd. The telegraph operator had to fake the signal to tell the rest of the country that the job was done because the rich guys simply could not figure out how to hit a nail. 26. The cinematic feast where cowboys roast a whole pig over a fire is a delicious lie because the actual diet of the West was a culinary nightmare consisting almost entirely of beans. They ate beans for breakfast and beans for lunch and beans for dinner until their digestive systems became biological weapons. This monotonous menu was supplemented by hardtack, which was basically a cracker made of flour and water that was baked until it became a rock capable of shattering human teeth. If a cowboy invited you to dinner, you would likely be served a plate of musical fruit and a cup of coffee that had the consistency of warm mud, because fresh vegetables were a myth to these people. 27. We assume every saloon was hosted by high-stakes poker games with tense staring contests. But the most popular gambling game was actually a mindless activity called faro. It was essentially the Candy Crush of the 19th century because it required zero skill and was played on a board with pictures of cards glued to it. The players bet against a banker who used a rigged box to deal cards, and the house advantage was so obvious that they called playing the game bucking the tiger. It was less about reading a poker face and more about blindly throwing money at a cheating dealer who was robbing you in plain sight, while you cheered for a picture of a king. 28. Wanted posters in movies always feature a crisp photograph or a perfect artistic sketch of the bad guy, but in reality they were usually useless pieces of paper. Photography was expensive and rare, so most posters just had a vague written description that could apply to half the male population. A sheriff would receive a poster looking for a man of average height with brown hair and a hat which describes basically every single person walking down the street. Bounty hunters were essentially guessing who the criminal was based on vibes because the actual wanted posters gave them about as much useful information as a fortune cookie. 29. The dramatic strategy of circling the wagons to fight off an attack is a military tactic that Hollywood completely invented to make battles look organized. Pioneers did circle their wagons at night, but it had absolutely nothing to do with defense and everything to do with keeping their cows from wandering off while everyone slept. A circle of wagons makes a terrible fortress because bullets go right through the wood and you are trapping yourself in a small area with panicked animals. If you actually tried to fight from inside a circle, you were just creating a convenient target practice zone for anyone standing outside of it. 30. Movies love to show heroes throwing dynamite sticks like they are modern grenades, but handling that stuff back then was basically playing catch with a nuclear bomb. Old dynamite was incredibly unstable because the nitroglycerin would sweat out of the casing and form explosive puddles on the outside of the stick. If you put a stick of dynamite in your saddlebag like they do in films, the friction from the horse trotting would likely cause you to explode into a cloud of pink mist before you reach the next town. Miners were terrified of the stuff because looking at it the wrong way or sneezing too hard near a crate could turn the entire mine shaft into a crater. 31. The scene where the hero runs across the roof of a moving steam train to fight the bad guy is a guaranteed death sentence that ignores basic physics. Steam engines were essentially giant coal-burning factories on wheels that spewed out thick black soot and burning cinders directly onto the roof. If you actually climbed up there during a ride, you would not be having a cool fistfight. You would be blinded by smoke and choking on ash, while the wind tried to peel you off the metal surface like a sticker. You would arrive at the front of the train looking like a chimney sweep who had been tumble-dried, and you certainly wouldn't have the energy to punch anyone. 32. The Hollywood trick of shooting a hangman's rope to save a friend from execution is the most mathematically impossible shot in history. A bullet is a tiny piece of soft lead, and a rope is a thick, twisted fiber, so hitting it from 50 yards away is like trying to shoot a mosquito off a moving roller coaster. Even if you miraculously hit the rope, the bullet would likely just pass through the fibers without snapping them completely, leaving your friend still hanging there awkwardly. The more likely outcome is that you miss the rope entirely and accidentally shoot the very person you are trying to rescue, which makes for a really tense conversation in the afterlife. 33. We think the cowboy era was ended by brave sheriffs and civilization, but it was actually killed by a simple invention called the devil's rope. Barbed wire fencing completely destroyed the concept of the open range because ranchers could suddenly slice up the prairie into private squares. It is hilarious to realize that the toughest men in history who survived blizzards and stampedes were ultimately defeated by a piece of pointy wire sold at the hardware store for pennies. The glorious cattle drives vanished almost overnight, not because of a war, but because cows can't walk through sharp metal fences. 34. Movies love to show a bandit tossing a saddlebag full of gold bars onto his horse like it is a bag of marshmallows. But gravity has a serious problem with that. Gold is one of the densest substances on the planet, and a bag filled with bars would weigh as much as a full-grown human adult. If you casually threw that much weight onto a horse's back, the poor animal would likely collapse under the sudden strain, and you would be stuck there trying to lift it. If you tried to run out of a bank carrying that sack over your shoulder, you would immediately throw out your back and spend the rest of the robbery crawling on the floor in agony. 35. The concept of a synchronized showdown is historically laughable because nobody in the Wild West actually agreed on what time it was. Before the railroads forced standardized time zones in 1883, every town set its own clock based on the local position of the sun. Noon in one town could be 11:40 in the next town, over which means coordinating a duel was a logistical nightmare. If you told a guy to meet you at 12 o'clock, he might show up 20 minutes late because his pocket watch was set to a different city, and you would be standing there in the heat looking like an idiot. 36. The classic survival trick of cutting open a cactus to drink the water is actually a fantastic way to kill yourself faster. Movies show desperate cowboys quenching their thirst with fresh cactus juice, but in reality, the liquid inside most cacti is a toxic alkaline soup that tastes like battery acid. Drinking it will immediately cause severe vomiting and diarrhea, which dehydrates your body at double the speed and leaves you convulsing in the sand. Indigenous people knew exactly which rare species were safe, but if a random cowboy tried the movie trick, he would spend his final hours on Earth in agonizing stomach pain, realizing that plants are not vending machines. 37. We all think cowboy boots look incredibly cool, but they are historically designed to be high heels for men who hate walking. The pointed toe and the high heel were engineered specifically to lock a boot into a horse stirrup, which is great for riding but an absolute nightmare for walking on flat ground. If you watch a real cowboy try to walk long distances in those boots, he does not look like a tough hero. He looks like a toddler trying to balance on stilts. They pinched the toes and had zero arch support, so the rugged frontiersmen probably spent most of their evenings rubbing their sore feet and complaining about bunions. 38. The dramatic gesture of biting a gold coin to see if it is real is a great way to shatter your teeth and look like an idiot. The logic is that gold is a soft metal, so your teeth should leave a mark, but the fool's gold known as pyrite is harder than human enamel. If you bit down on a piece of fake gold, you would not reveal a forgery, you would simply break a molar and need a dentist in a world where dentistry involved a pair of pliers and a shot of whiskey. Experienced prospectors tested gold by its weight or by scratching it on a rock, not by treating a dirty piece of metal like it was a chocolate bar. 39. The myth of the masked bandit hiding his identity is hilarious because wearing a mask in a tiny frontier town is the best way to get noticed. If you walked into a bank wearing a bandana over your face, you were immediately the most suspicious person in the zip code, and everyone would stare at you. Furthermore, most towns had a population of about 300 people where everyone knew everyone else, so covering your mouth did not hide your identity. The sheriff would take one look at your horse and your boots and your shirt and say hello to you by name because a piece of cloth does not make you invisible. 40. The image of the lonely cowboy sleeping by himself under the stars is total nonsense because freezing to death is not a masculine trait. Nights on the open prairie were incredibly cold, and firewood was often scarce, so cowboys would typically sleep huddled together or share blankets just to survive the temperature drop. The idea of the rugged individualist who refuses to be near another human is a Hollywood invention that ignores the basic biological need to retain body heat. If you actually tried to sleep alone on the ground in the middle of a desert winter, you would not look cool. You would look like a frozen icicle by morning. 41. We assume every outlaw had a cool nickname like the Sundance Kid or Buffalo Bill, but in reality, most nicknames were just mean insults. Frontier communities were not creative branding agencies, so they just named people based on their physical deformities or bad habits. You were far less likely to be called something awesome like the Killer, and far more likely to be known as Stinky Jones or Three-Fingered Jack or Diarrhea Dave. The history books tend to remember the cool names and conveniently forget that the most feared gunman in the territory might have answered to the name of Pancake Billy. 42. The chuck wagon cook was actually the most powerful man on the trail, not the trail boss like movies suggest. We usually see the cook as a grumpy side character serving beans, but in reality, Cookie was the doctor and dentist and banker and absolute dictator of the camp. If you made the cook angry, you did not eat. Or worse, you got served food with special ingredients that would make you regret being born. Cowboys were terrified of him because he controlled the food supply and the medical supplies, meaning he held your life in his flour-covered hands. And he knew it. 43. Kicking a door open to make a dramatic entrance is a movie trope that would result in a broken leg because frontier carpentry was surprisingly solid. Doors were often made of thick, heavy oak planks reinforced with iron bands to keep out bears and bandits. So kicking one would be like kicking a tree trunk. If a sheriff tried to bust into a room with his foot, he would likely bounce off and fall backward onto the porch while the bad guys inside laughed at him. The only way to get through those doors was with a battering ram, or a polite knock, because human ankles are not designed to smash through 2 inches of hardwood. 44. The wanted dead or alive poster is iconic, but most sheriffs were actually furious if you brought them a dead body. The legal system required a trial to prove the person was actually the criminal in question. So dragging a decomposing corpse into the office just created a massive amount of paperwork and legal headaches. Furthermore, bounty hunters usually only got paid half or nothing at all if the target was dead because it was impossible to question a corpse. The phrase was mostly a warning that the suspect was dangerous, not a permission slip to go on a murder spree, because bureaucrats ran the West just as much as gunslingers did. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If the real Wild West were filmed accurately, most people would call it boring, gross, and confusing, and turn it off in 10 minutes. Now the provocation. Which movie about the Wild West do you think aged the worst after this video? Not your favorite. The one that now feels the most fake and embarrassing. Name it. If this video ruined at least one movie scene you loved, hit like. If you enjoy watching myths get publicly executed, subscribe.